Ready?
Hello, my name is Jennifer Ball, and I'm going to be talking about interpersonal communication today. We're going to go over the definition of communication, then we're going to go on to a goal about communication. Next is barriers to communication, and finally we'll end with ways to overcome those barriers. Next slide. So what is communication? Communication is the continuous, complex, collaborative process of verbal and nonverbal meaning making. Everyone is always communicating something from the moment we are born. Even my little niece, who's only 1 year old, is communicating. She can't talk, but her mother still knows what she needs by her crying. That's still communication. We are always communicating. We work with others to have conversations. It's not a conversation by ourselves. So that is why it is collaborative. Since communication is always happening and it involves others, it is important to do it well. Next slide. So I have an overarching goal for my communications. This comes from Colossians 3:23 through 24, which says, "Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve." So my overarching goal in communications is to serve Christ through my words and through listening to others. Next slide. To do this, I need to enlarge the conversation. Relationships exist in conversations that make them up. This brings us to the EMC equation, which is identified needs plus intentional resourcing equals enlarging the conversation. I can enlarge the conversation by purposefully working on the areas that I struggle at in communication. Next slide. My behavioral blend is part of this. The DISC behavioral blends there are 4 of them: directing, inspiring, steady, and cautious. According to Uniquely Used Assessment, I am a CIS mixed with an S. This means that whenever I'm in private, I'm more open, but whenever I go out in public, I tend to be more shy. I'm indecisive, and I keep quiet about my opinions, and I'm not as interpersonal as I would like to be. I can relate well to others, but not so much in a large group. Carbonell writes about my behavior blend saying, "You show your strengths through your friendliness and kindness, as well as through your ability to solve difficult problems." That sounds like me. I'm also a good listener. What I need to work on, and this is part of my communication goals, is to be fierce communicating. Susan Scott's book, she describes it as intense, strong, powerful, passionate, eager, and robust. Those are the types of conversations I have when I'm talking about my family or my work, but my day-to-day conversations aren't up to par. Next slide. So there are potential barriers to communication. They are not listening to oneself, word confusion, negative labeling, advice giving, not truly listening, negative wording, and noise pollution. Next, we'll go through them one by one. Next slide. The first is listening to oneself. Effective listening involves not only tuning into others, but tuning into ourselves. Listening carefully to what we say and how we say it can teach us an immense amount about ourselves. I will purposefully listen to what I say and make sure it shows who I am. An example of this is if I'm yelling at my husband or at my students, I need to reevaluate because that's not who I am. Next slide. The next one is word confusion. A word is simply a representation of the thing that it names or describes. It is not the thing itself and may mean something different to the talker than it does to the listener. An example of this was whenever we were in Africa, everybody was speaking English, but depending on where they were originally from, they had some different meanings for things. If we went to a restaurant, we couldn't ask for a napkin because to most people there, that would mean a diaper. Instead, we'd have to ask for a serviette, so there wouldn't be the confusion. So this means that we should not make assumptions. We need to make sure that both the listener and the speaker are on the same page. And this means I need to clarify my statements and the statements made by others. Next slide. The next barrier is negative labeling. Negative labeling, saying that you're stupid or that you can't do something, will lead to a negative behavior, like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I say I can't do something well, I'm likely not to do well at it. Proverbs 23:7 says, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." So I need to be positive about myself and even speak these positive words out loud to avoid negative labeling. Next slide. Another one is advice giving. Seems we do indeed socialize people to give advice, ask questions, and be critical, none of which is truly listening. Petersen writes, "We all have ideas and relevant experience to share, but the trick is to wait our turn before we express them. So if I'm preparing my advice to give someone, I'm not hearing all of what they are saying. I may miss critical information and give them bad advice. So I need to listen without preparing to give advice." Next slide. The next barrier is not truly listening. If we can focus on one person's view at a time and establish human connection, we'll all feel heard, sense that we are valued, relax, and function better. And that's what we all want while we're communicating. Communication is collaborative, as we've said before, so I must listen when others are speaking. The listener is to provide safety, understand, and clarify without agreeing, disagreeing, advising, or defending. Internally criticizing the speaker's delivery, becoming emotional about a concept, listening for only general facts and ignoring details, pretending to be attentive, overreacting to certain words or phrases, and lack of attention may all hinder the communication process. Next slide. Another communication barrier is negative wording. We have a choice of what words we use. We can be negative and attack, judge, or accuse the listener or target. Instead, we should choose to phrase our words carefully and avoid those tactics. Those tactics cause the listener to get defensive and the message misses the mark. So a hint of this is avoid always and never. If you're using always and never, the listener is going to get on the defensive. They're going to start thinking about the one time that they did or did not do the action, and they won't hear the rest of your message. So instead of just speaking, I should think of how the ramifications of my words and how I can phrase it better. Next slide. Noise is another barrier. Interactions in social life may be seriously affected by negative noise, whereby actual or perceived behavior is less cooperative than it was intended. So there's two types of noise. Negative is where the actions seem worse than intended, and positive where the actions are perceived better than intended. The negative can cause harmful effects such as misunderstanding of communication, and it can also cause a degenerative spiral. An example of this is if I forget my phone at home or it runs out of battery, which seems to happen to me fairly often, and my friend or my husband is trying to get a hold of me all day and they can't get a hold of me, and they get angry at me because they can't get a hold of me when it was an honest mistake that I didn't have my phone and I couldn't get a hold of, or I couldn't call them back. Then I get their messages and I try to call them back, but they're upset at me so they don't want to answer the phone. And I can get upset at them because they're not answering me. So both of us are upset and we're not getting anywhere. That's a degenerative spiral. It's affecting our relationship. So how do we overcome this? Next slide. The answer is communication. Explain to the person why noise interfered with the message you were trying to convey. This can help undo the noise. So if I explain to my friend, hey, I didn't have my phone, I'm sorry, it was my fault, then maybe we can still be friends. But if I choose to be angry and not to talk to them, then the relationship could be ruined from the degenerative spiral. Next slide. So I have an action plan to become better at communication. I need to be a better communicator so I can reach my overarching goal of serving Christ through communication. I need to speak positively and with love. I need to avoid the barriers that we just discussed, and I need to keep noise from interfering with my message. Next slide. There are 5 steps to the process of change according to Burley-Allen: resistance, being unsure, assimilation, transference, and integration. I'm going to go over these each step. Next slide. The first is resistance. is continuing with your old habits. I must stretch myself to get past my shyness, and I must join the conversation. Next is being unsure, so I start using the new behaviors, but I don't feel comfortable with yet. This means even if it feels awkward at first, I must continue trying, or else I won't get past this step. Next slide. Assimilation is next, and that's where you start to feel comfortable. If I keep joining the conversation, eventually it will not be as hard. Next is transference, where you use the skill in more places. Once I am comfortable, I can start enlarging and entering conversations at every opportunity. And finally is integration. The new skill is automatic. In time, I will be less shy and I will automatically open up and talk. This is my goal, and I hope to get to that point to where I can enlarge the conversation. Here are my references on the next slide. Thank you.